Well, hello everyone. Pastor Jeremy checking in. It's our midweek devotion. I say that every week because it's true. I need to come up with a better catchphrase. Sports announcers be like, "Hi again, how are you?" or stuff like that. So I don't know. I need to work on that. But, anyways, I'm glad to be with you virtually. I am recording this on Tuesday afternoon. It is gorgeous outside. For February 7th to be in the mid 60s is just amazing, and so my hope is to take advantage of that and be outside this evening and enjoy this time. I come alive with the warm and the sunshine, and I think we kind of all feel that way. This past Sunday, it just felt like there was more energy because the week prior it had been kind of cold and rainy and just kind of dark, and then this past Sunday was just wonderful. So, anyways, I hope that you're having a good week, and we had a good first week of Upward basketball. Looking forward to this Saturday. We are hosting 2 weeks this year during the season, and so if you have already participated, thank you, and we'd love to have you again. If you had not yet signed up and you're wishing that you had been there, we have plenty of space, and so we'd love to have you serve this Saturday. Contact Bill Kahn, and he can let you know where there's a need. Bill Kahn or Meg Judd running our concession stand, the best concession stand you'll find in Williamsburg. It's been wonderful, and so we had lots of folks there, and it was a good thing last Saturday, so let's do it again. Today I am going to follow along with the narrative lectionary text, and I'm in Matthew chapter 8, and I'm not going to do all of it because, again, there's just sometimes it gives you a broad scope, and I just want to pick a particular section, and so I'm actually just going to be reading Matthew 8, verses 23 through 27. This is a very familiar story. It is the story of Jesus calming the storm. And so Matthew chapter 8, starting with verse 23. It says, "Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, 'Lord, save us. We're going to drown.' He replied, 'You of little faith, why are you so afraid?' Then he got up and rebuked the wind and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, 'What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him.'" This is a story you'll see Jesus calming the storm. We know the story later in different gospel or different time of walking on water and just different things that have happened. But in this particular story, it's very brief. And one of the things we have to be aware of is sometimes we read a story and think, well, this applies exactly the same way in every context. But we don't know all the intricacies. And so I would love to say this is how every storm of your life will be calmed. But I'm also a realist to know that we go through some really hard times. And so I think we're seeing an example of how God is present in the midst of our uncertainty and our rough time. And I certainly think that God cares for us and is present. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. All of these things are true, but we want to look at this particular story. And so thinking back to the way that the sea was viewed in this time period, we see the ocean and we worry about hurricanes and undercurrents, riptides, and all of the vastness and how much there is unexplored even in the ocean depths. There's some mystery, but we usually approach it with a scientific or a meteorological thing, trying to look below and see, or not below, but look at the systems that create these storms. But if you're looking at the time of Jesus, there was this fear of the sea. They didn't have Bill Meck, my favorite weather person. They didn't have some of these meteorologists, these weather trackers to be able to see what's going on. And so storms could pop up out of anywhere. But it was such a scary thing. Like, water is kind of scary now out in the oceans because unpredictable things seem to happen. But it was especially the case then. And so what you're seeing is this belief that maybe in some places that the gods were controlling these storms, and if you made a god angry, is it Neptune was the god of the sea, then maybe that was part of the problem. But anytime you were going out on a boat was a leap of faith in a different way. And so there's all of this mystical fear of what is going on, and then there's a realistic fear. I'm sure that they had close encounters with the storm, but we need to be aware that this is kind of the mindset that they have. So if you see that this is going on, we just take the text for what it says. And it says, "When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake." As a introvert, I appreciate this. Jesus saw a crowd and he's like, "Let's get out of here." That's probably not what Jesus was actually doing, but there's this idea that he saw what was going on, but he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. And how do you get from one side of the lake to the other? And that would be through a I'm sorry. I'm reading, but I'm reading the wrong text. I'm not going to re-record this. I'm just going to keep rolling with it. So that's what was going on in verse 18. Let me go and skip down as they have been on this journey now to get into the boat. So that does set the stage for us a little bit. But he's given them orders to cross to the other side of the lake. In verse 23, it says, "Then he got into the boat and his disciples followed him." So what we see is, as I had read, and that was a part of today's full reading, I just wasn't going to include it. But hey, we got bonus content. As we are going into this text, we'll see that the disciples followed Jesus. So I was reading this story today from the perspective of what does it look like when we step out and going where Jesus calls us? Now, again, I'm not being prescriptive of every storm that you will ever face in your life. Today, I just want to narrow it to those times when you do what God has asked you to do and you're not certain about how things will turn out. Those other things can be true, but I just want to focus on here for a little bit. And so it says, "Then he got into the boat and his disciples followed him." When is the last journey that you took where you just said, "Okay, Lord, you're calling me and we're going to get on board"? But it says, suddenly, out of nowhere, a furious storm came up on the lake and the waves swept over the boat. I'm thinking of that movie, The Perfect Storm, where you see just torrential rain and downpour and all of these things happening. But you're seeing that they got into this boat following Jesus, and all of a sudden, things are getting a bit dicey. One of the commentaries that I was reading was saying, we're not here to talk about the actual validity of the story of Jesus calming the storm, because we believe that to be true, but also think about what is going on in the lives of these disciples. They had been called by Jesus. They'll be called to be fishers of men. They've been called to be on this journey. They were called to abandon this life that they had once had and to do all of these things. And so they have gotten into this boat when all of a sudden things get a little sketchy. It gets a little dicey. They start to worry about what's going on. This is preparing the disciples for the moments that lie ahead. There are going to be times when they're following Jesus and all of a sudden it's going to cost them. And even Jesus tells them that many of them will actually experience death because of it. But I would imagine that in following Jesus, there were many encounters. The disciples were fearful of what was going on. They were worried about the consequences for their families and for their own lives and for Jesus. And so we keep that in mind. But Jesus went and the disciples followed. But immediately things started to seem to go bad. And so we see that Jesus is sleeping. That's amazing. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper. I don't know that I would be sleeping in this particular instance, but the disciples had to go and wake him and saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." They're going before Jesus, who knows all these things, that was probably aware of this storm, and is like, "Hey, Jesus, why are you not freaking out?" And he gets up. I imagine if he was tired, because it had been a long couple of days of ministry, and he was finally getting a good nap, and all of a sudden, he has this encounter with the storm. Jesus doesn't say, "It's okay, everybody. I'll take care of it. It'll be good." He says, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" And he gets up, he rebukes the winds and the waves, and all is calm, and the disciples are rightfully amazed. I would imagine that it was okay for the disciples to be nervous. God has designed us to understand fear and to know that there are certain things that can cause concern. But I imagine that the disciples in this moment were thinking, "Oh my goodness, why in the world is this our fate? We thought we were following this man and he is sleeping through a storm." I want to ask you, how do you respond the first time that something doesn't seem to go well? It takes a lot of courage to take that first step of faith. It takes a lot of courage to say, "Yes, Lord, I'm going to follow you into the ends of the earth and I'll do anything that you ask." But we know when we start out on a new mission, when we make a change in our life, when we make this incredible sacrifice, there is going to come a time when all of a sudden you look around and think, "Is this really all that there is?" There's going to be a time where we say, "Is this going to cost me everything that I've wanted? Is this going to be putting my family at risk? Is this going to be putting my finances, my time, my relationships, whatever it is?" And you're going to say, "Lord, don't you seem to care?" I find comfort in seeing that the disciples had this response. That the disciples who had witnessed all of these miracles, still in this moment of fear, were needing to say, Lord, why won't you help us? And Jesus doesn't just say, it's okay. He says, I wish you would trust me more. I've read that there are times when Jesus says, you have little faith, and he doesn't really mean it in the condescending way that we would take it, because a little faith is better than no faith. And it was interesting and amazing that these disciples, in the midst of their hardship, knew where to go. It was a sign of their faith. Now, maybe it wasn't enough faith. They weren't strong enough in their faith to be able to sleep through the storm. They weren't calm enough to just sit there and watch the waves and see what God was going to do. But they went in the midst of their distress and they trusted Jesus. I don't know what is going on in your life, but I know that God has called you and God has called me to do things that are oftentimes scary. It may not seem that way at first. There may be times in our journey where we step out, taking that leap of faith, thinking that everything is just going to be great and wonderful, and here we go. And then the next thing you know, the storm hits, and you start freaking out. Where do you turn when life is difficult? I think it's amazing that Jesus is not scared in this scenario because he understands is a part of the Father's plan. I love in the New Testament when we see these stories of Jesus and it points back to the work of the Creator. We see that throughout time, basically the only times that the sea is mentioned, when oceans are mentioned in the scripture, are the times when God is using his control over it. And in this situation, this is God coming to earth, Emmanuel, the Word made flesh, saying, even this storm is not something out of my control. They got to see the Creator working firsthand. So you may say that you're following Jesus. You may say that you put your trust in Jesus, but the question is, when things get difficult, are you prepared to go to the one who can do more? Are you trusting that God's plan is greater? And so whatever consequences you may face are not as great as the story that God is writing. So even if you have a bad day and even if you're soaked and it feels like you're taking on more than you can take, are you trusting that God is ultimately in control and still working through this? The disciples, in the midst of their distress, call to Jesus. He hears them, he teaches them, and he shows them his power. My prayer is that when we face these moments where it feels like we're in over our head and it feels like all is lost, that we would turn to Jesus, and our prayer of excitement would be seeing a God who saves us. If you go back in your life, you may have stories of this. You may think of times in your life where you're waiting on the answer to a diagnosis, or you went through a hardship, or you're really fearful for whatever it may have been, and yet you saw God bring you through. If so, those should encourage us to keep going. Not every storm gets calmed. And so I hate saying that as like the Debbie Downer on these things, but we know that sometimes the storms win, but not always. And if we are in line with what God has asked us to do, if we are where God has called us to be, if we are in the boat with Jesus, following him along the way, then we must trust that ultimately God is going to work all things for our good, because God is ultimately in control. So today, wherever you are, whatever you're going through, I would encourage you to consider this. Where is God moving? What storms are you facing that you need to simply say, Lord, please help? And even if the answer feels like, man, I wish you would trust me more, we know that God is excited and is pleased that you know who to turn to in your moments of distress. That's all I have for today. I hope that you are doing great. I hope to see you Saturday with our Upward Basketball, to see you Sunday in worship. It is so good. I'm excited. You'll catch my energy level goes up as I'm, one, not as sick as I have been, but two, as it feels like spring. I say this next week, it'll be snowing. Who knows? But for right now, we're going to say this is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Have a great week, and I will hope to see you soon.